All right, pressure's on. Well, that's a good question. What is my name? My real name is Beth Amos. At least that's the one that I go by legally. But my author names are Annelise Ryan, and I also have Allison K. Abbott as another pseudonym. It's a long story as to why I have those pseudonyms. I have three sisters, one of whom calls me Beatrice, one calls me Bertha, and the other one doesn't speak to me. So I'm kind of just schizophrenic and change identities from day to day. I'm a nurse, and I've been in nursing for over 40 years now, and I've done literally everything from birth to death. My very first job was working in obstetrics, which a lot of nurses think is a dream job. To me, it was a nightmare. It was the worst job I ever had. Obstetrics is pretty much just screaming and crotches all day long. And I also worked in hospice. So I'm currently working in an ER. I've been doing ER nursing now for about 17 years. And I've done it off and on in between other jobs. I always come back to it because it's just something that I like doing. It's a great way to do character studies, and it's also a great place to find humor, because medical people are some of the funniest people I've ever met in my life. Our humor is not the kind that everybody appreciates. It's a little dark. And the work is so unpredictable, and sometimes it's funny. As an example, this weekend I had a patient who was mentally challenged. I had to start an IV on her, and I was trying to tell her. She didn't speak very clearly, and I couldn't understand much of what she was saying, but I told her, I said, you can't move this arm as I'm working on one. I said, you can do whatever you want with the other arm. And she came in with a fever, so I was wearing a mask in the room that just loops around your ears and over your face. So as I'm putting her IV in and drawing her blood, she reaches over, takes my mask, pulls it out, and lets it go again, and snaps me in the face. And then she started cracking up laughing. And so did I. You know, it's so unexpected. And now my mask is crooked, and I'm still trying to do the IV, and I'm laughing. And then she meowed at me. So those are the kind of things about the job that I love. When I told my coworkers about it, they totally took it and ran with it. I came in the next morning, and one computer was completely decorated with cat motifs of all sorts. It's a great job for character development, and it's also where most of my series ideas come from. So it's been a good career. So I was going to talk a little bit about the how the Maddie Winston series that I write under Annelise Ryan came to be, because that's sort of what launched me into the mystery genre. I actually had three thrillers that were published back in the 90s with HarperCollins, and they were published under my real name. They actually say Beth Amos on the cover. But due to the changing book industry and a bunch of other things, I ended up not being with them anymore and having to find new agents and other things. So anyway, I've always wanted an outlet for writing. I've always loved writing, and I've always wanted an outlet for writing and sharing some of the humor that my coworkers have had over the years. Like I say, the healthcare people are some of the funniest people I have ever met. Well, except for that one girl I worked with. Never mind. But anyway, they're very funny, and I really enjoy that dark humor, and I know a lot of other people do too, although there are some people who take offense at it. But I wanted an outlet for it, and I kept trying to think of a way to create a humorous series. And I've always had an interest in forensics. I watch all the forensic TV shows, Forensic Files and Snapped, and all those other murder stories. It makes my husband really nervous. But anyway, I watch a lot of those, and forensics has always fascinated me. And when I went back to school to get a bachelor's degree, I had to take a sociology class, and I signed up for an independent study sociology class, and I had to come up with a study that I was going to do that had some sort of sociological connections. And at the time I was working in hospice, and so I decided I wanted to look at people who work with death and dying on a regular basis, on a daily basis. And I developed some questions about their backgrounds, their histories, what kind of families they came from, and then also how they coped with their jobs. What does somebody who works with dead bodies all the time, how do they refer to the dead body? Do they call it by that person's name? Do they call it the body? Do they call it the Vic? Do they call, how do they refer to it? What sort of body language and such do they use when they're around it? And my instructor loved the idea, so I signed up to spend some time with funeral directors, homicide detectives, and the medical examiner's office in Richmond, Virginia, which is where I lived at the time. And when I went to the medical examiner's office, I had never actually seen an autopsy before, so I was a little bit nervous about how I would do. I've been in surgeries. I've seen people cut open, so I knew I could handle that. But an autopsy is different because, you're dead. And so I wasn't real sure how I was going to do with it, and I didn't want to embarrass myself by being one of those people who, like, passes out or throws up or whatever. So I kept hoping for just an ordinary dead body, not anything really gross or nasty. And so we waited and waited and waited all day long for her body to finally come in. And then when it did, it was a young man who was, I think, 16 at the time, who had drowned. And he had actually fallen into the James River 3 months before, and his body had just surfaced. This was in March or April. It was around this time of year. So the weather had warmed up enough that the body had finally come up. So I'm thinking, yeah, this is not an ordinary death, and I'm not sure how I'm going to do with this. So I was very nervous. The person who was doing the autopsy happened to be Dr. Marcella Fierro, who, a little bit of trivia here, is actually the person that the Kay Scarpetta character that Patricia Cornwell writes about is based on. Although she could not look any more different than the Kay Scarpetta character. She's like the polar opposite. But she's a very fascinating woman, and it was a fascinating process doing this autopsy, watching her, find that this young man had a wallet in his pocket that they took out, and it had a love note in it from his girlfriend, which was still readable, even though it had been in the water for 3 months. We laid it out and read it, and we looked at his driver's license and his picture, and they had a newspaper article about when he'd gone into the river, and so we spent all this time getting to know this kid, and that was all very nice and very touching. But in the background, I was still worried, gee, what am I going to do when they cut this guy open, So the time finally came, and when they cut him open, there was an odor, because there's a smell to everything in life, but it smelled pretty much like the bodies that I'd seen cut open in surgery. There's a sort of visceral, blood-tinged kind of smell, and then a little bit of river water smell. It actually wasn't bad, it wasn't gross, and I remember thinking at the time, gosh, the inside of this dead body doesn't smell all that different from the inside of a live one. And then the writer part of my brain went, holy crap, that's a great opening line for a book. So I stored that. I went home and I wrote it down right away. And that was the genesis for the Maddie Winston series, a nurse who becomes a deputy coroner. And it actually is the opening line in the first book, Working Stiff. And I think that's what finally got me the publishing deal. It took me a long time to get it published. I actually had to self-publish it at one point. But now I have Dead of Winter. It was the 10th book in the series, I believe, and it just came out a couple months ago. The 11th book is finished, and I'm working on the 12th one now, so that series has done really well. I also have another series that I wrote under Allison K. Abbott that takes place in a Milwaukee bar. The bartender is the main character. And she has a disorder called synesthesia, which is sort of a cross-wiring of one's senses. So she smells things that she sees, and she hears things that she smells. And it's an interesting disorder that I discovered during research for one of my thrillers way back in the 90s that I just sort of logged away and said, I might be able to use this someday. And sure enough, I had an editor who said, I've kind of always wanted to see a nice cozy mystery series like Cheers. Takes place in a bar, and the bartender is the main character. Do you think you can come up with something? And I was like, yeah, let me see. So I gave her synesthesia, and that's how that series developed. There are 6 books in that series that are out, and that is the full series. It ended after the 6th book. And then I have another series that's actually a spin-off of the Maddie Winston series, the first book of which will be out the end of July of this year, based on another character that actually appears for the first time in Dead of Winter. So everything seems to be rolling along pretty good with the writing. I'm still doing the nursing, although I'm planning on retiring from my current nursing job at June 1st. I can't wait.